A gray dawn settled over the ruined port of Hamburg, its waters carrying the bitter scent of fuel, rust, and a nation finally brought to its knees. Smoke drifted lazily above the half-sunken U-boats, those once fearsome predators now reduced to quiet, memorials of a war that had consumed their crews faster than the steel could be built. Along the cracked waterfront, a line of captured German naval officers, men who had commanded fleets, lectured cadets, and believed themselves the guardians of the Atlantic, stood with hands clasped behind their backs, their faces drained of the authority that had once defined them. Their medals were still pinned to their tunics, but the weight of defeat pressed far heavier than nickel or brass. Among them was Admiral Ernst Keller, a stern figure in his early 50s with sharp eyes and a posture that refused to collapse, even when the Reich around him had already done so. For years, Keller had carried the burden of the U-boat war, signing off on patrols he knew might never return. Next to him stood Vice Admiral Otto Drexler, slightly older, his neatly trimmed beard hiding the tremor in his jaw. Drexler had once lectured that Germany's naval willpower could outlast any blockade. But as he surveyed the shattered harbor, he realized his speeches, so confident, then were now artifacts of a vanished world. A younger officer, Conrad Wall, barely 40, yet already weathered by years of responsibility, watched the smoke curl upward and tried to steady his breathing. None spoke. Their silence was not loyalty, but exhaustion. Orders came in clipped, English from American soldiers positioned just beyond the rail line. The Admirals had been processed, registered, and questioned in the efficient style the Allies had perfected by 1945. Now they were instructed to move toward a waiting convoy. Keller exchanged glances with Drexler, acknowledging what they both feared yet refused to voice. The Americans might treat them harshly, perhaps brutally. They had been told such things repeatedly. For years, the propaganda ministry had warned them that capture meant humiliation, starvation, and an end stripped of dignity. Drexler had even repeated those warnings to young officers, though he now felt a sting of uncertainty as the Americans gestured without threats, without gloating, and almost though he resisted, admitting it without hatred. The convoy rolled out of Hamburg's ruins toward a makeshift airfield. Through the cracked windows of the truck, the Admirals saw civilians scavenging among collapsed buildings. The war had chewed through every privilege, flattening distinctions until even high officers felt themselves sliding toward anonymity. Keller found his thoughts drifting toward numbers that had haunted every naval briefing. 783 U-boats lost, tens of thousands of sailors gone, and supply lines so thin in the final months that many ships never sailed for lack of fuel. The Kriegsmarine had once envisioned itself as Germany's shield against the world. Yet by 1945, it had become another casualty of a war fought on delusion. When the convoy stopped, the officers were escorted onto a military transport plane. The engines roared as Allied crews secured the compartment. Wall clutched the armrest tightly. He had never feared the open ocean, yet something about rising into the sky as a prisoner filled him with dread. Keller noticed and gave him a small nod, the kind he used to give junior officers before a dangerous patrol. It was not reassurance, merely recognition of shared uncertainty. As the plane lifted above the ruins, the officers watched Germany shrink beneath them, its cities reduced to pale grids, interrupted by blackened scars. Hours passed. The aircraft interior filled with the metallic hum of flight, punctuated by the occasional creak of the fuselage. Drexler tried to rest, but found his mind returning to whispered rumors from other captured officers. Some claimed the Americans obeyed the Geneva Convention meticulously. Others insisted those claims were propaganda meant to disarm their morale. He had no way to know which version awaited them. He touched the inside pocket of his coat, where a small notebook rested, containing the final entries he had written before capture. On one page he had scrawled, "If we lose, let me at least keep my humanity." The irony was that he had feared the Allies would take it from him, never imagining how much his own government had already stolen. As daylight faded into a muted horizon, the officers caught sight of a coastline ahead. Lights dotted the shore in neat, deliberate rows, nothing like the blackout Germany had endured for years. The aircraft descended toward an American base, its runway glowing like a pale river under the night sky. Keller braced himself, expecting shouts or the kind of humiliation whispered about in propaganda briefings. Yet when the doors opened, the American guards who approached did so with professional restraint. They did not sneer. They did not strike. One simply gestured, saying, "This way, gentlemen," as though addressing foreign delegates instead of defeated enemies. The admirals exchanged uncertain glances as they were escorted toward a holding area. The air smelled of grass and unfamiliar blossoms, carried on a gentle wind, an ordinary fragrance, yet so alien after years of smoke and salt that it made Wall swallow hard. Keller studied the layout of the camp, noting its fences and watchtowers, but also the tidiness, the absence of chaos, the faint murmur of distant laughter from American servicemen off duty. The normality unsettled him more than hostility would have. Hostility could be explained. Kindness, however small, could not dot as they were led down a gravel path. Drexler whispered to Keller, "If this is a performance, it is remarkably convincing." Keller did not respond, though he felt a quiet unease coil inside him. Nothing so far resembled the horrors they had been promised. No barking guards. No deliberate shaming. Instead, there was order, warmth, and a disquieting sense that the Americans were not acting at all when they reached the temporary barracks. A young American lieutenant handed them each a packet containing blankets, toiletries, and a brief note outlining camp regulations. The items were mundane, even modest, yet the very ordinariness felt surreal. Drexler looked at the blanket in his hands, its fabric clean and soft, and wondered aloud, "Why treat us like this?" No one answered. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying scents of soil and early summer. Keller paused at the threshold of the barracks, staring into the dim interior, and sensed that whatever lay ahead would not resemble the nightmare he had expected. Still, he hesitated before stepping inside. Something in the air, some quiet. Unspoken shift told him that the most disorienting part of captivity had not yet begun. A cool veil of morning fog drifted over the rolling fields of Maryland as the German admirals stepped down from the transport trucks, their boots sinking slightly into the soft, dew-soaked earth. For a moment, they simply stared. This did not resemble anything they had imagined. Instead of harshness or chaos, the American POW camp unfolded before them in orderly rows. Clean wooden barracks, gravel paths swept with surprising care, watchtowers standing silent rather than menacing. Beyond the fence, a distant barn lay tucked against a slope of green. And somewhere nearby, a rooster crowed an oddly domestic sound, almost mocking the tension sitting heavy on their chests. "Admiral," Keller blinked as an American guard walked by carrying a steaming cup of coffee, the rich aroma drifting toward him like something out of an unthinkable dream. Vice Admiral Drexler watched the guard sip with unhurried ease and felt an uncomfortable jolt of envy. It had been months since he last tasted anything warm that was not thin soup ladled from desperate rations. Even Conrad Wall, whose face rarely revealed emotion, allowed his eyes to trail after the rising steam as though it were a signal from another world. "Welcome to Maryland, gentlemen," an American lieutenant announced, his tone crisp yet devoid of triumph. The officer's uniform was neatly pressed, his expression professional, and his posture so relaxed it unsettled the newly arrived prisoners. They had expected hostility, scrutinizing glares, perhaps even taunts. Instead, the Americans behaved as if hosting foreign visitors rather than overseeing defeated enemies. The Germans were guided toward an intake table, where crates of supplies were stacked neatly beside clipboards. Keller noticed that the men processing their information did so with attention, not indifference. One soldier, barely 20, handed Drexler a slip of paper and saluted not out of respect for the Reich, but because Geneva Convention rules required American personnel to acknowledge the rank of their prisoners. The young soldier seemed to understand the technicality, yet he still carried himself with a disarming politeness. Drexler hesitated, unsure whether to return the gesture. When he finally nodded stiffly, the soldier smiled as though they had exchanged a secret. The brief moment left Drexler unsettled in a way the thunder of artillery never had. They were escorted to the mess hall next, and the scent that greeted them was nothing short of bewildering. fresh bread, roasted meat, real butter. Keller slowed his steps, wondering if this was a trick of the senses. The Americans ushered them through the line without fanfare. Plates clanged softly, trays slid across counters, and ladles poured generous portions. One server, noticing Wall's hesitation, offered an encouraging nod and added an extra spoonful of vegetables. The Admirals found an empty table. For several seconds, none moved. Then, almost ceremonially, Drexler broke a piece of bread and held it to his nose, inhaling deeply before tasting it. His eyes widened, and for the first time in months, he looked less like a man collapsing under the weight of war. Keller tasted the stew next, and the warmth that spread across his tongue left him momentarily frozen. It was not merely good, it was better than anything he'd eaten since 1943. This cannot be real, Wall murmured, staring at the butter melting across the bread on his plate. They must be showing off for the first day. Keller swallowed slowly. Then they have gone to great lengths. Around them, American guards chatted casually, some laughing at quiet jokes, others reading newspapers as they ate. None paid the Germans more attention than necessary. The normalcy was jarring, like stepping into a world still living while their own lay in pieces. The contrast felt almost cruel, yet beneath the calm lay something sharper, confusion that turned into doubt, and doubt that tugged at the beliefs they had carried across the ocean. If these men were supposed to be cruel, why were they serving food that civilians in Germany had not seen in years? Why were they speaking with courtesy rather than vengeance? Drexler had braced himself for humiliation. Instead, he found himself treated as a human being, a privilege he hardly remembered possessing. After the meal, the prisoners were shown their barracks. Inside were sturdy wooden bunks, fitted with clean mattresses and blankets folded with military precision. A small potbelly stove sat in the corner. Wall ran his hand over the blanket, feeling its softness as though testing for some hidden trick. Keller noticed the faint scent of detergent fresh, unmistakably American. There were books on a shelf in the corner, English novels, a dictionary, and even a worn volume of Goethe in German. Where did they get these? Keller asked, gently lifting the Goethe book. Red Cross deliveries, answered the American escort. You'll have more soon. The officers exchanged glances. The knowledge that these comforts were not exceptions, but standard procedure sent a ripple of disbelief through them. It was Drexler who finally voiced what they were all thinking. If this is imprisonment, then our country lied to us. The words hung in the air, dense and irreversible. Keller had suspected it, Wall had feared it, but hearing Drexler speak it aloud felt like something inside the room shifted. The lies that had sustained their war effort began to crack. Outside, they were taken on a brief walk around the interior perimeter of the camp. They passed a small garden where posts were cultivating vegetables. Further along, a group of enlisted prisoners far younger than the Admirals played cards at a picnic table, laughing under the watchful but relaxed gaze of American guards. The Admirals noticed that the guards carried rifles loosely, not in a pose of menace, but simple routine. Keller slowed as he observed the scene. It was impossible to reconcile this environment with the horrors they had been promised. Do you feel it? He asked quietly. Wall nodded. A strange sensation. Like discovering the ocean is not as deep as we thought. Or discovering it is deeper, Drexler added. As they returned to their barracks, the sun lifted higher, earning away the last of the fog. The camp looked even more peaceful in daylight, too peaceful. Keller's instincts, sharpened by years of command, whispered that there was meaning buried beneath this calm, something he had not yet uncovered. The Americans' hospitality was not a facade, nor a show of arrogance. It was something else, something strategic, or profoundly cultural, and Keller found himself disturbed by how deeply it affected him. That night, as he lay under the clean American blanket, listening to the crickets outside, he felt an unease unlike fear. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a revelation. For the first time, he understood that the war may have ended on the battlefield, but another, quieter reckoning was only beginning. A gentle afternoon sun filtered through the trees as the German admirals stood inside the fenced compound, watching a group of American guards toss a baseball back and forth beyond the wire. The scene felt almost surreal. The rhythmic thump of leather gloves, the easy laughter, and the casual posture of the players made the war seem impossibly distant. Admiral Keller found himself transfixed, sensing that this ordinary moment held some deeper truth he had not yet grasped. For years, he had believed that enemies were shaped from iron and hatred, yet these men moved with a confidence that came from neither. Their freedom seemed rooted in something softer, an assurance he could not name. Vice. Admiral Drexler felt the same disorientation, though he tried not to show it. He had been trained to read subtle intentions, to detect hostility even behind courteous gestures, yet here he found none. The guards spoke to each other about mundane matters, wives, weekend plans, the price of gasoline, and the sheer normality made him uneasy. He realized, with a slow sinking sensation, that America was not performing for them. This was simply how the country functioned. Even the restrictions placed on the prisoners felt measured rather than punitive. When a guard politely reminded them to stay within the marked area, Drexler felt a flicker of shame at how quickly he obeyed. Conrad Wall, meanwhile, sat under the shade of a broad oak tree, observing a small group of German enlisted men playing improvised chess with stones. Their laughter was unburdened, almost eager, as though relief had unlocked something fragile within them. Wall felt a pinch of envy that disturbed him. He had spent years ordering young sailors into perilous waters, and seeing them now relaxed, fed, and slowly recovering forced him to confront the truth he had ignored. Their suffering had shaped him more than he had ever admitted. He closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself to feel the warmth on his face. It was the first peaceful moment he had experienced in years. Over the following days, the admirals became unwilling witnesses to the camp's quiet philosophy. Mercy was not a performance here. It was procedural, habitual, woven into the structure, as naturally as the fences that enclosed them. They saw it in the way meals were served with predictable generosity, in the access to books and newspapers, in the guards who enforced the rules firmly, but without cruelty. For men raised within a rigid, hierarchical military culture, this restraint felt alien. Keller noticed that even when tensions flared among prisoners, the Americans did not retaliate with collective punishment. Instead, they separated the troublemakers and resumed the routine as if calm were the natural state of things. One afternoon, Keller was surprised when an American naval officer visited the compound, expressing interest in speaking with the high-ranking prisoners. The man introduced himself as Commander Harris, his tone respectful yet firmly professional. He asked the admirals about U-boat logistics, ship endurance, and tactical doctrine, not to interrogate them, but to understand the shape of the war from their perspective. The conversation was unsettling in its civility. Harris even acknowledged German innovations with a level of candor that felt almost disarming. When the meeting ended, Keller realized he had not once felt belittled. Instead, he felt something else entirely. The faint stirrings of introspection he had long suppressed. Beneath duty and pride, Drexler experienced a moment of unexpected clarity during a music gathering organized by prisoners. A group of Germans had formed a small ensemble using a donated piano and handmade instruments. When they played a soft Schubert piece, the melody drifted through the camp with such fragile beauty that Drexler felt his throat tighten. An American guard paused nearby, listening with genuine appreciation. For a fleeting second, Drexler saw not soldiers divided by allegiance, but human beings bound by the same longing for solace. The realization unsettled him deeply. He wondered whether compassion could reshape men more profoundly than fear ever had, and the possibility left him afraid of what he might become. Wall struggled most with the shifting atmosphere. He felt as though the camp's gentleness pressed against his conscience, demanding an honesty he had long avoided. One evening, he wrote a letter to his wife describing the food, the clean barracks, and the strange decency of their captors. He hesitated before sealing the envelope, realizing how unbelievable it would sound to a family surviving on ration crumbs. The contrast gnawed at him. If he admitted the truth, it meant acknowledging that the regime he had served so loyally had misled him. Yet the more he experienced this American mercy, the more impossible it became to cling to the stories he once defended with conviction. Keller sensed these quiet transformations unfolding among them, and he felt a corresponding shift within himself. Something about the camp's daily rhythms, the predictable meals, the respectful treatment, the absence of vengeance forced him to examine the beliefs he had carried into the war. One night, unable to sleep, he stepped outside and stood beneath the stars. The sky above Maryland was clearer than he remembered seeing in years, unobstructed by smoke or searchlights. As he gazed upward, he realized that the war had narrowed his world until even the heavens had seemed hostile. Now, in captivity, the sky looked open again, as though inviting him to reconsider everything he thought. Immutable, yet the deeper truth arrived unexpectedly the next morning. As the admirals gathered for roll call, an American sergeant approached holding a small stack of letters, Red Cross delivered mail from Europe. The prisoners stiffened, bracing themselves for tragedy, but the sergeant's expression carried no grim warning. When Keller received his envelope, he felt its weight with trembling hands. Inside was a brief note from his sister, describing hunger, ruin, and the struggle to rebuild amid endless uncertainty. As he read her final line, he understood the full force of their captivities. Paradox. The enemy was treating them better than their own homeland could. Today, smoke drifted lazily above the ruined outskirts of Bremen as the train carrying the returning German admirals rattled along the warped rails, its wheels clattering a weary rhythm that echoed through the hollow silence of a defeated land. Fields once thick with harvest lay untended, dotted with the skeletons of burnt farmhouses. The officers stared through the grimy windows, each lost in the shock of what awaited them. Months of American order had softened the senses. Now every shattered building felt like a blow. Admiral Keller watched a group of children digging through rubble, their motions slow and pained, as if childhood itself had been stripped away. He pressed a hand to the glass. Unable to reconcile the two worlds he had inhabited, Conrad Wall sat beside him, his jaw clenched tightly. He had imagined homecoming as something hopeful, but the devastation outside erased any hint of comfort. Piles of bricks, broken windows, and collapsed bridges stretched endlessly. At a crossing, they passed a woman carrying a bundle of firewood nearly larger than herself. She moved with a stubborn dignity, yet the exhaustion in her steps revealed the price she had paid. Wall felt a pang in his chest, realizing how far removed their American captivity had been from the daily desperation here. Drexler, sitting across from them, murmured a quiet prayer under his breath, though he had not prayed in years. When the train finally stopped, the platform was eerily quiet. A cold wind swept through the station, carrying the faint smell of smoke from nearby ruins. Families waited in small clusters, their faces thin, their clothing worn, their eyes carrying the haunted weight of survival. The admirals stepped down slowly, bracing themselves for recognition or reproach, unsure which would come first. Instead, they were met with hesitant embraces, tears, and questions uttered in trembling voices. Drexler's sister clung to him, whispering how she feared he had starved, and he felt the shame of knowing he had eaten better as a prisoner than she had as a free citizen. Keller's reunion was quieter. His younger brother approached him with a stiffness that bordered on accusation. "You were fed well in America," he said, not as a question but as a verdict. Keller nodded, unsure how to respond. His brother looked away toward the shattered skyline. "We survived on boiled weeds some weeks." The words pierced Keller more deeply than any battlefield wound. He had prepared for grief, but not for this new gulf between those who had returned and those who had endured. As the admirals walked through the town, the full scale of Germany's collapse unfolded before them. Churches reduced to hollow arcs of stone. Herdon of wandering refugees searching for anything salvageable. Posters urging unity and reconstruction command. The sailor's mother lived in a cramped apartment with cracked walls and a single coal stove struggling against the winter air. She welcomed Keller politely, though sorrow lined her features. As he apologized for failing her son, she placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "War takes everything from everyone," she said. "But what you do after peace begins matters more." Her words echoed in his mind long after he stepped back into the street. Conversations across the ruined cities revealed a growing truth. Returning posts carried stories that conflicted with the propaganda many civilians still believed. When the admirals spoke of American fairness, of food received without humiliation, of guards who treated them as human beings. They were met with disbelief, then astonishment, and finally a cautious hope. Their testimonies spread quietly at first, then more openly, shaping a new understanding of the enemy, who had defeated them not only through force, but through restraint. In the months that followed, Germany began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. The admirals found themselves surprisingly involved in the early administrative efforts, their leadership skills repurposed for civilian needs. Keller assisted in coordinating transport routes for food distribution. Drexler helped reconstruct the Naval Academy's library, determined to fill it with books that questioned as much as they instructed. Wall volunteered with youth groups, teaching discipline without ideology, structure without cruelty. Each step forward felt small, yet each carried echoes of what they had learned in captivity. Still, the nights remained restless. Keller often lay awake hearing the distant clang of reconstruction crews, each strike of metal reminding him of the moral fissures left in the war's wake. One evening, he opened his sister's letter again, the one he had received and fluttered against lampposts stripped of glass. The Allied administration's notices were everywhere: ration guidelines, rebuilding schedules, curfews offering order in a landscape that had forgotten it. The admirals realized quickly that they were returning not to the country they had served, but to one struggling to remember what it had once been. In the days that followed, each man confronted his own reckoning. Drexler visited the port he once commanded, now a graveyard of twisted metal and sunken hulls. Standing at the water's edge, he recalled the Schubert melody played in the camp, its fragile beauty now contrasted against the harsh cry of gulls circling the wreckage. "We fought to restore strength," he whispered bitterly, "yet we delivered only ruin." For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his choices. Unshielded by rank or rhetoric. Wall returned to his childhood neighborhood, finding only fragments of what he remembered: a half-standing bakery, a courtyard filled with debris, a familiar wall marked by shrapnel. In a small shelter, he found his wife, thinner than he imagined, yet still carrying the spark that had once drawn him to her. When he told her about the American kindness, the meals, the blankets, the unexpected humanity, she listened without resentment. "If mercy exists," she said softly, "perhaps we can still rebuild." Her simple acceptance humbled him more than any confession he had prepared. Keller sought out the family of a young sailor lost under his in the American camp, and read the final line he had not fully grasped before: "The world will not remember what we believed, only how we choose to begin again." As he folded the letter, he felt a quiet clarity settle within him, a conviction that mercy once given demanded to be passed onward. Yet even as Germany struggled toward renewal, Keller sensed that the greatest confrontation still awaited him, not with enemies or allies, but with the truth he had carried home. And though he did not yet know it, that truth was about to show him just how deeply captivity had changed not only his understanding of America, but his understanding of himself.